Hello, welcome to episode 5 of the Hirewell Recruiting Insights podcast. I'm your host, James Hornick, partner at Hirewell. What we want to talk about this week is recruiting and how it is becoming more and more of a marketing function every day. What was historically thought of as a HR function or maybe a sales function, depending on your take, is really becoming a hybrid as the market and how people like to be communicated with is changing. And joining me on this podcast is our usual host and our CEO and fearless leader, Matt Massucci.
Hi James, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. So I wanted to, since we're on the topic of recruiting and branding, I think first things first, I wanted to rename the podcast. I had 2 ideas for this. So first, I think the Hirewell podcast is a great name.
Rolls off the tongue.
I just think it's so bad that it's good and that people won't forget it. And then I also thought the How to Hirewell podcast is also a great name, maybe a little bit easier, but I don't know what your thoughts are.
Maybe we can have it up to a user vote or a listener vote.
So, anyway, so it's an interesting topic, and when we're discussing recruiting, I want to make sure to our listeners we're not really differentiating between third-party recruiting versus internal recruiting. It's really overall recruiting on all levels in terms of how corporations do it and how individual recruiters do it, regardless if they're internal or external. And you've been, following this and in this industry is longer than I have, frankly, which is how many years combined do you think we have in this?
Too many.
How many decades? My God, a lot.
Approaching 4.
So, what I thought, because I think it's an interesting topic, but I was reading some posts on LinkedIn, and I always think of it, and you and I have talked about this a lot, how people think of it as a sales function, it's becoming a sales and marketing function. But the post that I saw, they were talking about, people, it's now a marketing function, not an HR function. You and I take it for granted, I think, because we're not traditional HR people, but most people, when they think of recruiting, they think of HR. And I don't know, do you have any take on kind of how that differentiation happened? Because I think that's before even getting to the marketing aspect and how things are changing because of how media consumption is changing. It's the thought process of where talent acquisition actually belongs to begin with.
Sure. Talent acquisition is a close partner with HR, always has been. Maybe years and years ago it was definitely a part of HR, but it's become such a challenge and such a the war for talent or the ability to attract top people is challenging, and so it needs to be something where it's not just posting a job and hoping top people apply and then having an internal HR person screen them. You need to work hard. You need to attract them. You need to get them excited about your organization, and you need to figure out how to get them on board, because you're competing with a lot of different people, a lot of different places, and they're gonna do it better than you if you don't make it a core competency. So yeah, I agree. We've never believed that it should be kind of sit directly in our HR. It just should work closely in conjunction with it. But as you mentioned, the trend has changed a ton. I mean, it's years ago it was sales oriented because you really had to do in a one-to-one manner in terms of directly cold calling someone at their desk to get them interested in an opportunity, or at best you could post a job in the newspaper and hope somebody read it on Sunday and then applied. It's completely different from that. You have the ability to tell your story to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and that's where it has shifted to marketing. You can reach a lot of people with one message or one bit of information, and how do you amplify that? That's kind of what the key differentiator is for companies.
I think too, and moving into what the difference between sales and marketing is, because I think even if you're looking at it from that standpoint, right now the best salespeople are also marketers, the best marketing people are also sales, even those competencies are somewhat getting blurred a bit. And I guess defining the terms, and I like what you said, if it's one-to-one versus one-to-many, there's certain skill sets, whether you're looking at, when you're trying to define what is sales and what is marketing. Obviously employment branding I think is really the key thing here in terms of the companies that are doing that well versus the ones who aren't doing it at all. But even short of that, I think I want to talk a little bit too, eventually maybe a little bit later on, about there's a couple levels of, is this happening at a corporate level versus also an individual level, the recruiters, whether they're internal or external, kind of what they're doing. Let's get into employment brand, because I think that's the big thing that a lot of companies, the ones who are frankly kicking ass at this, are making it a core competency versus the ones who maybe not even be aware of what it is, or the ones who are struggling to hire and not even realizing, there's a lot of places that still think, okay, I'm going to hire a recruiter, they're going to solve my problem, then that one doesn't happen, they're not sure why, and it's because there's so much going on with employment brand that they're not doing. So
yeah, I think if you look at over the trends of the last 10, 15 years, back then a company had a nice looking website. That was ultimately the extent of the research that a person would do in making a job decision. And now there's dozens of sites. There's a lot of different places they can go. They can make a huge decision to opt in or out of looking at a job at your organization before you get a chance to even talk to them. So that whole concept is essentially what employment branding is. If it's how do you put your best foot forward, and that really ties into kind of what this overall theme that we've been talking about from our content perspective this month of how do companies build their dream teams, how do they attract the best people out there, and your first foot forward is always going to be your employment brand, whether someone wants to work for you or at least come on an interview and learn more about your company based on the research they've done. And again, there's more and more out there, and if companies aren't controlling it, they're really going to be behind the companies they're competing with for talent.
I think that people doing, another thing I want to mention too is just the amount of review sites that are out there. And I think that if you're not, you have to live it, right? You can't just invent a brand and people are going to believe that's the reality of what is work at your company, because the word's going to get out. Like word of mouth has been around, but that's on steroids now. There's sites like Glassdoor and other places like that. If you have core values and ultimately you're just a good place to work for, it makes it that much easier to hire. And I think that companies who take a holistic approach of looking at who they are internally, have they created a good environment where people who are their current employees can become their best advocates, and the people who are working the job every day, are kind of assisting in that process. Because that's the other thing too. I think that the best way to hire, and you and I as people who make a living off of having people want to hire, the best way to hire is always can your current employees, do you have referrals? And that's just infinitely easier when your current employees are on board because they're excited about what you're doing. They feel it's a good place to work, versus places that might frankly struggle with that. So I guess the key thing is employment brand. Like everyone has employment brand, whether they spend time on it or not. It's just is it a strong brand or a weak brand, and is it a good brand or a bad brand? So is there a level of awareness, and is that awareness good or bad?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I remember when Glassdoor was, a new thing, and the concept seemed sort of far-fetched at the time, right? Like it's just going to be a bunch of people whining about their old company, but it's taken off, and I think they got bought for $1 billion. So obviously they're doing something right. But it's interesting because the way employment branding is right now, it's you have Glassdoor at one end of the spectrum, which is a lot of ex-employees who might be dishing on their their former employer, which is not necessarily the story you want to be told about your company. The other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of kind of what I consider puff pieces or fluff pieces about kind of all the great little perks and benefits that your company offers. So I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Is how do you really truly tell the story? How do you give a nice look behind the scenes of your organization? Savvy job seekers can be pretty proactive by just looking on LinkedIn and seeing what the tenure of your employees looks like. I think that's a pretty nice thing. It's not necessarily part of your employment brand, but it's clearly an indicator of being a good place to work when your average tenure is long. I think that's something we hear about internally. It's one thing I'm really proud about is that we have, I think our average tenure is 4+ years per person, and as a third-party recruiting firm, that's a long time. I think that's dog years or something along that.
How many years I've been here for again?
Yeah. So there's a lot out there, and I think there's stuff that people, companies can do, and it is, as you said, it's a matter of whether you like it or not. You have an employment brand, and if you don't, it's because nobody's ever heard of you, and then you have no employment brand, and the odds of getting someone to apply to your organization or to come on site for an interview are just that much smaller.
I think in internal communication too, like taking that employment brand and empowering your, whoever's in charge of this, making sure that all the employees are empowered with the knowledge they need. And I think if you're going to break that down into buckets, it's one, what do we typically need to hire for? Like we've made hires just based upon random kind of chance people we've run into. But if, it's easy for us since we know we're hiring for, you and I at least, but like recruiters, it's always something we need. But companies that have tech, they have finance, accounting, they have HR, they have all these different areas in digital and whatnot. The more attuned your employees are into what you actually need to hire for, but then also allowing them to knowing who the point person is internally at the organization, if you actually talk to someone who sounds interested, and then obviously being able to pitch your own company, like what do you guys have going on that's exciting. So making sure your people on the front lines are armed with the knowledge they need. And it doesn't need to be deep, but I think there's a big difference. That's a big impact you can make fairly easily. So.
Sure. Well, we at Hirewell have a natural advantage because everybody's here is a recruiter, so I think they get the concept. But for other organizations, it's important, right? Like, how do you communicate what your needs are? It can be as simple as having a strong employee referral bonus program. I think it's got to go deeper than that, and sort of what you touched on before of how do you become, or how do you create this this workforce of referrers, people who are love their organization that they work for and want to actively bring their friends or people they know that are great to join that company. And how do you create that culture is the most important thing for companies to do.
Okay. Getting into one other thing I want to kind of talk on this is there's a couple levels, I think, too, as things are becoming more of a marketing function, both on a corporate level, so company-wide level, right? High level, what's your company doing, and are you taking more of an employment branding? You having maybe a practice focuses on that? Is it tied in with the marketing? But then there's the individual level. If you're talking recruiters, and this is both third-party and internal recruiters, what mindset do they have? And talking from a third-party mindset and as well as from an internal HR mindset, which are two different mindsets, but neither of them traditionally are marketing focused. Like when I think of someone who's come up through these ranks in third-party recruiting, it was very sell type of mentality. People who maybe came up through HR was more of a very maybe HR mentality, neither of which took maybe that focus on how we kind of define our own brands and how we kind of hone our own skills and how we communicate with people the way they want to be communicated with. So I think we kind of talked a good amount about kind of the corporate level and how things are changing. On that personal level though, like how have you seen individual recruiters, whether internal or external, now versus 10 years ago? Like who's doing well and what kind of things are they doing that you think maybe vary a bit?
There's so many more channels to go out there and to reach people, to get in touch or to have yourself be found. I think that's a big step. I mean, I think what I've seen in companies or individual people going that route of how do you get creative? I mean, the internet is it's an amazing thing, and there's a lot of different routes to go. I mean, you have to go where the talent you're looking for is, right? And you need to be then seen as a leader, kind of a thought leader in that space, to identify them and then get them to listen to you, and then say, hey, I like what he or she's saying. I'm interested in joining their company, or I'm interested in having a conversation with them about my career and see if there could be some good possibilities with it. So, there's no shortage of it. I mean, between videos or social media or kind of niche sites targeted towards a specific industry or career or function, like you have to be innovative. You have to have a curious mindset and want to go find those things and spend time researching it, and then get to know how it can work for you.
Yeah, I've seen that obviously a lot myself. Personal brand is an interesting one because I think that the explosion on LinkedIn, I think in the past year and a half or so, and this is just not specific to recruiting, but LinkedIn historically was, I mean, when you and I thought of LinkedIn 10 years ago, it was just recruiters and people who wanted to find jobs, and it actually kind of boggles my mind how it became like this free employee directory that everyone signs up for, because it's weird if you're not on it for some reason. It's actually kind of genius how they pulled that off.
Yep.
But fast forwarding to now, when I go on LinkedIn, it's the news feeds are far more active than they ever have been before, and it's actually not recruiters and HR people, it's marketing people and sales people typically, or who's making most of the traffic. So, and I think that's it's indicative of, I think there's an opportunity for a lot of people who are in recruiting, both internal and external, as well as people who are in HR, to really build their own personal brands by taking more of an active approach and giving information, spreading their knowledge. Which is honestly stuff I've been working on, obviously. But when you think about, like I said before, like branding and employment branding is good versus bad, they're strong versus weak, and I think it's the same thing with personal branding. So either people know you or they just don't know you. How many people, if you're a developer, how many recruiters do you think are calling you or emailing you per day?
Lots.
And if there's one who, wait, I actually recognize this name, this is someone I've seen, this is someone who I know knows what they're talking about, like, exponentially more likely that person is going to want to get back to that recruiter versus every other recruiter who's just kind of nameless and faceless out there.
Yeah, it's a good route to go. I mean, when talking just about recruiting, without a doubt, like anybody in the recruiting or talent acquisition space should use LinkedIn as their platform to be seen as a thought leader, expert, and there's just kind of, if you're not looking at it that way, you're missing the mark. But that then really expands to, anybody, sort of anything you do, whether if you're a traditional salesperson, if you're a business leader or executive, or if you're a marketing person. The concept of being seen as a thought leader is a great one, and it doesn't mean it can be a variety of reasons why you want to kind of build out your personal brand. But I think the mistake a lot of people make is, I'll talk to people who are at the point in their career where they have to make a job change, right? Something went wrong, something happened, their company did a riff, or they're not doing well, and they've been there for way too long. They've not done nearly enough personal networking, they've not been active in the community, and they're really starting from so many steps behind anybody who has been active and has built a personal brand. So I think we're talking obviously within recruiters or HR people, but I think that just is a lesson I try to give everybody, no matter what you do, is you always have to put a little bit of time towards that, because you never know how it's going to benefit you, but it will absolutely in one way or another.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like the people that I follow, that I see a lot fairly frequently, I can just imagine if something happened to them, if their company closed down or they were laid off, it would take them 2 seconds to find something new. They have such a high profile versus you and I talk to people every day who struggle. So it's interesting. I guess speaking of like a struggle, like the disparities between, and I guess that's one thing I wanted to mention too is employment branding is something every company has, which we probably mentioned a couple of times already here. But I think that's what's interesting is the companies who are already aware this shift was happening versus the ones who aren't. It's always going to be easy for Google and Apple to hire people, right? Because they have so much free employment brand. I'm sure they spend a lot of money on it too. They do a ton more than anyone else, but there's other companies who have paid a lot of attention to this, and as marketing, and I should say as the way that people want to be communicated with changes and marketing techniques become more advanced, as content becomes more advanced, these companies that have embraced that are just that much further ahead of companies who have not. And I think that the rich keep getting richer, and I guess the hard to hire still having bigger problems. So.
Yeah, I mean, when you're competing, in a lot of these content, whether it be blogs or podcasts we put out, we've talked about, when you're competing for talent, you're going against these large global tech behemoths who are, also big consumer brands, and it's hard to compete, right? Like, if you get a call from Google or Facebook or Apple, like, for a job, it's a lot of people are going to consider it, right? And if it's for your random company down the street with 50 people, like, how are you going to keep up with that? I mean, we talked once a few months back where, Google has more recruiters than a lot of companies in Chicago have employees. So it's kind of a mind-boggling statistic, and they've also got a better brand than you. So it's tough. You're and their stock's worth a lot, so they can give a lot of that to people. There's a lot of reasons why you should be worried if you think your employees might be interested in companies like that. But like the thing that companies need to think about is you can compete. You have to work hard at these things. It's everybody's job, from the CEO down to everywhere in the organization, of how do I set myself as a place where people want to work, where people are happy. I mean, you don't want to lose people first and foremost, because it's unemployment's microscopic at this point, and if you're losing people, you're going to struggle, right? And so then you have to start there, and then you have to figure out how you can win for talent, and you have to be creative, and we've been talking for the last several months about different options or ways to do that. But then there are companies who they do struggle. They might I know we've referenced Glassdoor a few times, but they have a negative, they have a low rating on Glassdoor, and that's tough. And some of it's justified, some of it's not. We worked with companies who have had negative reviews. I mean, sometimes it was a couple of years ago where they had a different culture, or they had a different leader, and they've been able to get past that. But you have to be proactive with that. I think there's I mentioned before, there's a lot of things out there where companies can be a little bit more kind of put out some fluff about the nice things they're doing. But one of the things we're excited about is through our partnership with Holistic is they're working on kind of like the data-driven approach to drive employment branding. Because what people really want to know, whether everybody cares about different things. It could be the diversity of the organization, it could be the happiness of the people, but how do you ultimately share that with prospective employees? And we're going to be pushing out some of our internal numbers over the next couple of weeks, And it will talk about, again, we believe in transparency. It's going to be talking about, again, what is our average tenure of stay here? What do employees like about working here? What would they like to see improved? I mean, I'm not saying everything's perfect, but we work hard to listen to our employees and make things better. And I think that's kind of the direction where things will go with a lot of organizations is, how do we tell our own story? How do we make it real and have it be believable, but doing it in a way that it's going to, it's going to be sincere and it's going to attract top people.
I agree with that 100%. And I think that one thing I want to make clear is I root for good companies and companies that are well run. And I'm aware of some of the places you're kind of, referring to, I'm not going to call them out, that struggled in the past, that, knew they had problems and then fixed them. And I think that if we're going to do like net takeaways here, the number one most important thing, if you're struggling to hire, you need to first look at are you legitimately a good company to work for? Are you tuned into what your employees think? There's a lot of places out there that think they are. The management top level thinks they're a great place, but they're a little too, there's not that attuned into what's happening, for the worker bees. They might not be aware of, it's hard if you're a 50 or 100 person firm, you're not talking to a person every day. So getting help and really understanding how well run you are, because if that's not done right, all this employment branding stuff and all this kind of marketing tactic, it's really all for nothing, because the truth always comes out.
Right.
So starting from that level, and I don't know how much you want to talk about holistic. We can go.
I'll save that for,
dig into that. Save that for another podcast.
Yeah, save that for next episode.
The how to hire well, or the hire well podcast. Next time we're here, we'll be talking about maybe how to fix your company. So. But anyways, so yeah, again, I guess as key takeaways, I think it's important to realize, one, you first have to fix your company if you do have legitimate issues, if there's something not being done right, because again, it's all for nothing if you're not a good place to work. Then past that, it's just, I think if you want to put it all into one bucket, it's finding a way to communicate with job seekers and the public who you are at that point, making sure they're aware. And I've known a lot of companies that are good companies, but no one ever heard of them because they never thought this was important. They never thought we're just gonna keep our heads down and build our product or do whatever we're doing. And it's admirable, but it's really becoming untenable, I think, in terms of if you need to grow when you're competing against as many people you are now. So, and then on both a company level, having a solidified plan for how you're going to communicate that employment brand, but also making sure your recruitment teams, and again, I mean both internal or if using people externally, are people sophisticated enough where they have know how to carry themselves well, how to articulate, how to, I always harp on when I'm talking about marketing related things, since I have a background in marketing, data-driven storytellers, people who know how to tell a story about what they are and what they're doing. And I think you want to make sure whoever's on your front lines can tell your story, can articulate it well. And I think in today's landscape of recruiting, it's not just good enough to know how to hard sell and be a hard worker, but you have to know how to communicate with people in a way that's relevant to them.
Yep, 100%.
So, well, I think we're just about wrapping up here.
Hopefully you're still listening.
Yeah, we checked all the boxes and what we want to go over. So I want to thank everyone for checking it, for listening in, and we hope to have another podcast out for you soon.
Thanks a lot.